Hey guys, it is Tim here with Tabletop Terrors. We are fun-loving RPG inspiration. This is your first time joining us. This is really something that we're going to try to do more of. This is a hangout where we're just going to tap members of the community and kind of just talk to them and just pick their brain. Some of the members of the community that we're a part of, the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group, are just brilliant. And there's a lot of diversified tastes in there. And so having conversations about adding different elements to your campaign, adding different elements to your game that some of these people in the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group specialize in. Tonight, I'm joined by none other than Chris Wilhelm of Drop Dice. How you doing tonight, Chris?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me on board with this. I'm excited to be the pilot episode, if you will, of the series here.
Totally. And I'm really excited because tonight's topic is specifically Asian-inspired D&D. I'm talking samurai, I'm talking ninja, I'm talking Ronin, adding that stuff to your campaign setting. And it doesn't matter. It's system agnostic advice for the most part. We play D&D 5th edition a lot, me and James. But Chris, I know, dabbles in a lot of different systems, so we're also going to draw from his wealth of various systems. So tonight's going to be really conversational. It's just a hangout. We are going to visit the chat, pop in. We got a lot of cool people in there already watching. Feel free to comment in the chat. I'll make sure to read the comment for anybody who's watching later because that chat isn't saved, and we'll kind of go from there. So I'll just kind of jump right in. Chris, you run a lot of Asian-inspired games. Would you say that this is your favorite genre to run in?
Yeah, actually, it's one of my favorite to play in as well. I just like the story structure of how Asian episodes and sagas are actually depicted, which we'll talk a little bit more about that because it is a little different than the standard European adventure, and it has things that appeal more to me on a gamer sense, like for role-playing and things like that, which a lot of the stuff you can actually carry over into European-feeling games and make them feel a little bit more of almost a romanticized European game.
Sure, and totally. So I want everybody to know kind of the baseline we're starting with, and it's that I'm a tourist here, right? I don't know anything about Asian-style adventures more than the average person. You know, I've seen a lot of movies in pop culture and, I've watched my fair share of anime, but I want to make sure that everybody watching knows that this isn't going to be some cerebral conversation where two connoisseurs go back and forth and wax philosophical. Chris will probably wax philosophical. He's a sharp dude, but I am just here to learn. I'm a beginner at this stuff, and so I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. So if you are like, well, I want to add this stuff to my game, but I don't really have, the first clue. Well, great. We're on the same page. So, Chris, as someone who's kind of new, as someone who doesn't really know this, like this style, this genre very well, what do you think some of the most important pillars are that would be different from my standard, like Lord of the Rings, high fantasy? What are a few major things that I need to get in my brain about doing this right?
Okay, so Lord of the Rings is actually a really great transitional piece, I think, because Lord of the Rings has a lot of elements that are similar to the way Asian storytelling works.
Right.
Whereas fantasy elements, typically in a traditional European fantasy, it's more about the combat and the struggle, like the physical struggle of things. If you look at Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of social aspects, and social is actually one of the main pillars in like Legend of the Five Rings or any sort of Oriental adventure type game. Essentially, your social standing and your honor are kind of the major things that your character should be concerned with, no matter what culture you happen to pick. Those are kind of relevant topics for the entire region. There's also the idea of genealogy, divination, and divine right. Things like that come up a little bit more inside a more Asian-targeted story. And
Gotcha.
The other thing that I really like about them is the hero's journey is a little bit more present, and it takes a little bit different turn. Typically in the hero's journey, a hero starts off as nobody, they get a little bit stronger, they experience a defeat, and then they come back for the ultimate victory in the end. In typical fantasy and folklore for cultures like China and Japan, the ending changes a little bit. A lot of times there's no such thing as a victory without cost. And that's something that you kind of don't see in European fantasy. Is typically victories are, yay, let's celebrate, the kingdom has a great day. In a traditional fantasy Asian story, the hero might die at the end and never see his actual goal come to fruition, but it happens even after his death, maybe directly from him or possibly because of his example getting passed on to a future generation. Another thing that you see is a lot of deities and demigods who will sacrifice either themselves, their followers, or their divinity itself to be able to create a better empire. So there's this idea of the state being part of the self, which doesn't really come up a whole lot in traditional European fantasy either.
Yeah. And those are some really solid pillars immediately. I love what you're saying, and it does take a different turn from, like you said, standard Western or European fantasy. It's really interesting because it seems like, European fantasy is more centered on self. It's more centered on the hero and achieving their goals at any cost. And so I really like that. So if we had to make a list, I'm going to try to recap that so I can remember it. The first one was, what was the first one? I remember the second one was genealogy. Social. That's what it was.
Which has a subcategory of honor.
Right. It's very involved. It's about your honor and making sure you pay homage to where you're from and your roots and your,
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Another one that kind of falls into social as well that I didn't touch on is respect is a big thing inside there that you always give people the due respect. So if you check out my channel, I run Legend of the Five Rings. My players are very good about actually bringing up things like saying the character's name and then adding san, which is the appropriate term in a Japanese-style game for
right.
People. Or they say sama, which would be somebody that they view as someone who's respectable in a higher position than them, and then domo, which is a much higher station, like a daimyo or something like that, somebody who they greatly respect. You could also use domo for a teacher, although referring to them as teacher is typically the more acceptable term.
Gotcha. So I could change and I could eject this into my game immediately by just adding this level of this social aspect of calling different people who are in different stations these titles. I think that's really interesting because in a European sort of, you will just call it like high fantasy game. In a European fantasy game, there's knights where it's like Sir such and such, or there's kings and lords and dukes. But I like the idea that I am calling you these things dependent on how much I respect you. I think that's a really cool thing.
And that's actually a really cool point, though, too, is not only can you show your respect by using certain titles, well, they're naming suffixes. You can also show disrespect by using different ones. Like you can use the suffixes for child when you're talking to a grown man.
Oh, wow.
Insult them.
That's really cool. So maybe if you have some time at some point, you could maybe put together a list of these, and I could put it in the comments below.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Inside the description of this video, I gave a link to a Google file that I put some different weapons from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that could be translated into Asian weapons is on the list. There's a few extra European weapons and then some new weapons on that list. The other place I'd recommend checking out is actually Absolute Tabletop's Be a Better Weapon Master, because you guys hit some of those inside there.
We did.
The one thing I will say that you guys did do, however, is some of your Asian weapons are a little powerful, so fair warning to the GM, you might want to check those first.
We thought it fit the tone. For sure. And so you can check that out on absolutetabletop.com. It's called Be a Better Weapon Master. I'll also put a link to that in the comments. I do want to visit the chat and kind of see how everybody's doing tonight. But the first thing I want to say is, as Chris mentioned, go in the description of this video and it's the first link. It says Asian-inspired resources from Drop Dice. And what this is, it's like a little starter kit. And, Chris, if you continue to add to that, man, just keep going on. And the more people that find this video will find a bigger and bigger little trove here. But this is like a good little starter kit. You can click on that and start kind of steeping yourself in it. Now,
I'm a big fan of giving away little starters and hints and stuff like that. So if you're interested in stuff like this, like I've got a whole file that's about how to start mapping digitally. If you go to my world building series, I do stuff like this just because it's things that interest me. I love teaching people about the things that I like.
Right, and getting them, a little folder that they can click around in, see some things they're interested in, and like bite into it is a big part of it, so that you're not just listening to this video, but you can, actually take action. I want to touch on one thing that I love inside this folder: the movies, TV, and books for inspiration. So Chris has put together this kind of hack list to learn by osmosis, essentially, and kind of just steep yourself in this culture. There are movies, books, just a lot that you can just start devouring, because one of the best ways to learn about this is seeing it done expertly in different forms of media.
Yeah,
so check that out below.
I know anytime I do any sort of game, I'm just absorbing any media I can find. The last book I actually read is actually on the list, which is The Initiate Brother by Sean Russell. And even if you don't read the book, the art alone is very inspirational. The monk inside the story actually kind of feels like the monk of the four elements. I forget what it is in 5th edition. I think it's 4, right?
I think so. I think it's the 4 elements.
I always get confused because in Chinese mythology, there's 5 elements, so it's a little different. Same with Japanese mythology, but they're a little different from each other even.
So we have a comment here from Notorious White Moth, and he says, I just have to comment here. The fixation on honor is a stereotype that came out of 19th century language barrier. Social registers are as complicated in Japanese as tense and aspect are in English.
It is, absolutely. The reason I mention it as an important aspect of the game is because it's a trope. And tropes are good and bad, and that's one of those tropes that really is good for your game.
Sure.
So it kind of helps reinforce the idea of courtly nature and hiding your insults. And so I think it's a good thing to include in your games. I think it's really good for Japanese-style games. For Chinese-style games, they don't really use the suffix or the naming suffixes as much.
Sure.
They typically will refer to teachers as Sifu, but beyond that, you're referred to by your actual station. And the one thing that I would say is that's a great takeaway for any game, really. Like you mentioned in typical fantasy games, you have knights and things like that. I don't hear a lot of people on online games referring to Sir Drake Warren as Sir Drake Warren. They just refer to him as Drake or Warren or something along those lines.
Yeah, no, and it's important to know that when you're starting to kind of get involved in this kind of thing, there are going to be those tropes that you can latch onto and implant into your game. And I'm guilty of being afraid to use tropes because I think, well, no, that's a trope and I want to kind of be original. I almost feel like sometimes I want to be the expert before I use the information. And I actually want to just say, don't worry about it. If you feel like you want to take even just some thin surface level stuff from this hangout and drop it into your game, try that out. I'm not a historian. I want to know enough to be immersive to the players and that they feel like the culture is different. But I'm with you. I also want to use the tropes that exist in their minds as a really good starting point so that they don't have to learn all of this culture and feel like they have to do homework or break the immersion or anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. So there is a comment by the Macronomicon asking about the different the naming suffixes and things like that. Where I pull it from is I happen to play a lot of Legend of Five Rings. It's in the core book. It's right at the beginning, and they give a very quick, short, dirty version. However, if you go to the Legend of the Five Rings wiki, there's an entire article about etiquette and what's considered proper and what's not considered proper. And it's a long read, but it's worthwhile, especially if you're going to play Legend of the Five Rings, because those are things that are socially going to be important, and they can affect how people view you and things like that. I think that's kind of a major point of playing these kind of games, is understanding the social ramifications of what you do and what you say, because sometimes things that you don't say but do are way more important inside these games as context subjects.
That's really great. And that's, I think, a really different angle on role playing. And so I could see, at a table where people who are very well versed in these sorts of things and well versed in the language of the game, the physical language of the game, and just the overall social ramifications of every move you make really having ripples. I think that could be a really cool game to play if everyone was on the same level as far as the knowledge of those things,
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of key about playing any game that's got a lot of social ramifications behind it from a GM standpoint is being clear with your players beforehand. If you've seen my L5R game, there are times where my players are going to do something that I know is going to be dishonorable, and I'll say, "Hey, are you sure you want to do this?" And they get kind of a "Hey, buddy" check right before they lose their honor points for doing something. And a lot of good players will stick with the decision to lose those honor points because they feel as a character that they've been wronged and they're taking action against it, or something similar to that.
Right. Yeah, and I love that. And I think there would be so much subtlety in every action, whereas, in a lot of the role-playing games, I play, it's fun and I'm playing a character, but I don't have to think about how I'm sitting or where I'm standing or who I look in the eyes. And, I just made those things up. I don't know if those are even close to...
Yeah, those are absolutely things that could be important. It depends on how you want to include these things inside your game. Like, one of the things that I'm real particular about is when a lord or someone of higher station comes into the room, that you stand and wait for them to acknowledge you and seat and tell you to sit. I've had players that they had an entire meal where they were not allowed to eat, not allowed to sit, because the lord never acknowledged them and told them that they could sit. They had to endure him eating in front of them, assigning them a stupid task that they knew was below their station, and basically be quiet the whole time to maintain their honor, because this person is someone who clearly outranks them as far as society is concerned, even if he is dirtbag.
Wow, that's so cool. That's such an interesting factor to me. So, to kind of speak again to the beginners, take whatever level of this you're comfortable with. If you want to decide that with your players, just for this part of this, the campaign or in this setting, if you want to just choose one of these things particularly so that it's easy, the one Chris used is a great example. You have to remain standing until you've been acknowledged and are basically allowed to sit. That's one cool thing that you can add instead of having to worry about all of these things. And as the players have an experience with that and they use it and they'll remember it, it would be cool to then have this culture come up again and implant the same scenario so that you can then, they know how to react this time. They know what to do. They've been there. They've done that. So everything we're telling you, take bits and pieces and inject it in any way you want. There's no wrong way to do it. And go with the comfort level of your game and your table, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I think is really great about us being able to play online, if you guys have noticed, I've turned off my overlay because I want to show something that I think really sells the game. And you can do this with any setting, period. But this is an overlay I use for L5R. By just making some font changes, having an appropriate picture, and choosing a name that's appropriate really sells the character for any genre, period. So this is just solid gaming advice.
That's awesome. And maybe if you have some example overlays, or like, I don't want to super put you on the spot, but if you have some flattened PSD files you can throw in that folder too, maybe, where someone could just throw their name in there. I don't know if that's cool, or so that they could kind of jump in, or maybe you have art assets you like to use.
Actually, yeah, if you go to the reference document that's got all the Netflix and Hulu links and all that inside there, there's actually a link to a Pinterest board where I have a ridiculous amount of pictures that I keep squirreling away inside there for any sort of inspiration, because I'm a very visual learner. So any sort of like images and things like that just really seep well into my brain and help me become more creative.
That's perfect. I love that. Now, in the title of this video, we promised samurai, ninja, and Ronin, and we're going to get there. But you hit on something that I think is very important in any game, and I'm sort of a tourist when it comes to it in Asian-inspired D&D, and it's naming things properly.
Mm-hmm.
Help me get my head around what would be appropriate to name certain things and where you get your ideas from. Now, I want to make the caveat that I feel like I know some Asian names, but I don't know if I'm just naming them, if I'm naming a character, I don't know if I'm naming them the equivalent of like Jones or Smith, like how common some of these names are. And I also don't know what would be seeming like really silly, like, oh, wow, he just named that thing a bear, something where I mess up like that. Give me some basic advice on naming things.
So my favorite thing to do is use the website 20,000 Names, and I pull real-world names from specific regions that are closely resembling what the fantasy realm that I'm playing in, whether it happens to be an Asian one or if it happens to be a European one. And I will basically pull a name that's appropriate inside there. And the best part about 20,000 Names is it does tell you what that name means. So if you already have an idea of what your context in your surname is going to be, you can find a name that makes sense. If you actually translate the names of all my characters, they always mean something like Light of the Sun or something like that. It's very flowery, which is super important to kind of nicknames in Asian cultures, especially in the Wuxia genre, or however you want to say it. Some of these terms, I'm probably going to use the wrong pronunciation. It doesn't devalue the fact that I appreciate them, just means that I don't know how to say them correctly. So
sure.
But there's this idea that you can have nicknames and stuff too, and that swords should have names, and pretty much everything should have an actual name to it, and the name should have almost a meaning behind them that can go well with the character or the story of what that item is. For example, Murdoch in one of my games, he received a sword that was called First Snow, and the reason it was called that is because the craftsman that was forging the weapon spent 7 years, and when he finally finished it, the hardest point to forge on the blade is actually the tip of a katana. Mm-hmm. The kasaki is what it's called, but once he finally finished honing the edge and getting it perfect before it was tested, the first snow had fallen and the first snowflake hit the blade as it was being crafted, giving it its name. And that's kind of an interesting story that you can tell a player to make that mundane +1 generic sword sound a little bit cooler to them in D&D terms. You can do stuff like that all the time.
I love that. And it goes back to the importance of names, and the name of something carries a lot of weight. And I think that's why I can arbitrarily come up and say like, yo, let's name this thing in our campaign world Deep Vault, because I think that's cool. And, I'm working with the guy, but I can't do that as readily because I don't want to make something seem silly when names are so important. So I love that resource. So maybe you could drop a link to that too. I'm giving you a bunch of homework.
Yeah. Google Translate's a really good one too. Basically, because you're playing a game, nobody expects your translations to be 100% perfect or anything like that, because ultimately you're not playing in Japan. You're playing in a Japanese influenced setting or a Chinese influenced setting or Korean or whatever it happens to be. And if you get a name that sounds roughly correct, then that's fine. You could even take the name as it's translated and maybe change a couple of letters to phonetically sound correct when someone reads it, and you'll get the same point.
And that's 100%. In fact, that is how I came up with the name of the region in Dragongrin called Reichen. Mm-hmm. Because I thought, okay, let me back up for anyone who's joining us for the first time, and this is kind of your first stream. My brother James and I, we have a campaign setting that we publish through Absolute Tabletop, and it's called Dragongrin. And the basic overarching plot is evil has won and good is scattered throughout the land. Well, one of the regions is an Asian region. And for a while, it was called something else. And I don't even remember exactly what it was called. But I remember, Raiko, Raiko. And I kept saying it like Raiko, and it just didn't have a cool factor to me.
Mm-hmm.
But then I typed in the English. I went to Google Translate and I typed in, I think, giant, and I tried to figure out what the Japanese translation was, and I think it's Kaio or something like that. Let me look here. I probably should have prepared this before I did it. But the idea is, it was like giant island.
Right.
Is what the idea, and it's Raikogen. And I thought, oh, okay, there you go. And it just sounded really cool. It sounded interesting to me. So this is a cool thing, especially if you want to go. It was called 20,000 Names, you said, right?
Yeah, 20,000 Names. I believe it's a .com. If you just Google it, it'll come up right away. But it's got it's huge list, and it's broken down by cultures. You could even select things like, I want names that sound like they're from warriors, and it'll give you all the cultures, all the different names that are associated with warriors or the term warrior.
That's perfect. Because what I'm thinking is, if you want to go get these definitions, you said there's some flowery terms in there. If you even want to go 1 degree different because you want to kind of really go out there, take one of the flowery words that you know is linked to this awesome word and drop that into Google Translate to even get 1 degree different if you really want to go, crazy with it.
You definitely could. And you were saying that you were kind of concerned about having characters that maybe have a name that's like John or something very common. That's not necessarily a bad thing either. Like, think about Roman games, the second son, Secundus. That's still a very Roman name. You could have a character who's got a name that literally just means second son. And so long as it's in the correct kind of geographic terming, it'll still work and be fine.
I love that. No, I think that's fantastic. And see, to me, the ideas of what I'm trying to do is I want to be faithful to, like, you have a really deep experience with this stuff. You have a love for it. And I want to make sure, because I love it too, but in a different way. Like I said, it's not something that I play in or use very often. So what I want to do is take these core elements and make sure I do them justice. I want to make sure that in the campaign setting of Dragongrin, that when people go to Raikogen, players like you, Chris, don't see glaring mistakes that we've made in small things that could have been different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good point to bring up, that one of the things that has bothered me in the past about different iterations of Oriental-style adventures is this idea of a Pan-Asia, where everything just kind of feels like it's crammed together. It works if it's a very large continent like Asia is, but a lot of games, their Asian culture is condensed to a smaller area, and they've got everything represented, but it just kind of feels jumbled.
Yeah.
L5R can be guilty of this sometimes, because there are certain clans that feel like the Unicorn feel very Mongolian influenced, but at the same time they're in a Japanese culture, and their neighbors happen to be Romans from the north, and they have Arabian Nights type setting that's over to the east, and there's a lot going on culturally that feels like it's a bit much. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is Raikogen. You mentioned the samurai, the ninjas, and stuff like that. Are you leaning a little bit more towards Japanese? Because storytelling does differ between country as well. Like Chinese folklore stories typically end on a lighter note and less tragedy than Japanese stories do. And then there's Korean stories, which are kind of in the middle. And then there's Filipino stories, which are a little bit more on the spiritual mythic side.
Okay.
And a lot of times they don't even interact with the human world. They're kind of unique stories, and they're really interesting to read, but I don't know how they translate super well to games unless you were doing a lot of horror.
Sure. No, okay, so this is great. So let's sort of transition into, because I still want to go over Samurai, Ronin, and Ninja, but in the context of something a little different. The campaign world of Dragongrin, this region of Raikogen, I'm going to tell you a brief synopsis of the idea of what I had in my mind before we began, and then I'm going to see if you like where I'm kind of headed with it, or if you think it'll be too jumbled.
Okay.
So for anyone watching, for anyone who hasn't heard this, I want Raikogen to be a series of, I just imagine this cool island chain that looks like a crazy like spiral. I don't know why. I think that would be neat. But whatever it ends up looking like, I want it to be these different islands. Maybe there's an island in the center, sort of looking like this flower of land or something. The idea is that this is where most of the giants in Dragongrin will live. Now, there'll be other giants on some of the, central regions and things like that, but each one of the giants has a different clan that is basically related to what kind of giant they are. So you have, all of the different giants from the 5th edition monster manual, the hill giants, the fire giants, etc., each on their own island. So that's the basic idea. I also wanted to play with the social aspects of servitude, indentured servitude of some sort. So I wanted to talk through that with you, how the social classes would work. But what if I did it carefully and worked with James and, made sure to execute it properly, would it feel like it could work if each one of the different giant cultures represented a different culture that you just described? So you have one that's more Japanese influenced on this island. Then you have sort of this influence on this island and this. And it's just peppered in little differences. I'm probably not going to go super deep into there unless we make a splat book on the world, that particular island. But do you feel that'll be too jumbled? Or do you think that would work because it would immediately build conflict in and give each one of the giants their own identity?
So the thing I would say is if you went with each country independently, like a representative of Korean folklore and things like that, and then a representative Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, even if you want to touch into like Indian culture and things like that, the only thing that I would see being a possible issue is because it is a smaller area that you're talking about, it would feel like it's a really strong difference between each nation. Them being that close together, they probably wouldn't be that spread out in their philosophy. A good thing for you to look at would be how Japan was when it was in its states period, where there's multiple states in Japan. They're all Japanese, but they have different ideologies and things like that to keep them as separate states. And they kind of war with each other. China went through the same thing. Korea went through the same thing, where there's kind of this warring states period for all of them, where there's basically the same philosophy, but there's still internal differences between each one. So I think it would be a little bit better if you stuck with kind of a single nationality or maybe two distinct separate ones that could be represented as factions, and lean them a little bit more towards like political factions than necessarily like cultural factions.
Yeah, I think that's actually, you're spot on. And as you were talking, I was like, yep, he's right. Because first of all, as a game master, I'm not learning 7 different factions. I'm going to pick my favorite one and then say, they're all this one. Second of all, as a player, I'm not going to learn 7 different factions,
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think if I had to choose, I would say based on my personal experience, I would probably choose Japanese, especially because of what I picked up on where you said it's a little more tragic in its tone. And to me, that really fits with Dragongrin. So I would probably go Japanese on it. Now, as far as it goes, without going like too deep into how it would work, how would you see on a high level these different, would you call them houses? What do you call them? Do you call them clans? Dynasties?
Because we're looking at Japanese culture, clans are actually really, really an effective term. Some of the other cultures, they break down into houses, which have a different contextual meaning than what clans do. The way that the clan structures were organized in Japan, it was more of a military thing. Your house was a representative. If everybody's pretty familiar with Game of Thrones at this point, the clans effectively are the houses in Game of Thrones. They have a certain tone to them. They have colors. They have land that they're in charge of. And one of the things that is important that kind of gets glazed over in fantasy is that samurai is a social class, not a career. And that's one of the things that a lot of people, when they design a game, they make a samurai class for a character to be, which is fine, but really any warrior could be a samurai, and technically any scholar could, because you had the money to learn. So it's a little bit of a misnomer.
Okay, so this is actually kind of a good jumping point to go into this little segue. So we'll stick with houses just to keep it easy for the sake of my understanding for now.
Totally fine.
So we'll keep it with houses. We'll say that there's a different house for each one of the giants, each type of giant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want you to tell me the basic difference between a samurai, a Ronin, and a ninja. Because I know I have a westernized version in my head, but I'm not even going to waste everybody's time with that. So, tell me in whatever way you want.
Yeah, so the simple definition is a samurai is the highest social class that one can hold inside the Japanese culture of that time period. And basically, you're a noble. You own land, you have servants that work for you, and typically you don't have to work for a living. Basically, because the samurai own the land the peasants till and take care of, they pay tribute to the samurai, who then pays tribute to his daimyo, who then pays tribute to the emperor, and there's kind of this hierarchy structure. From there, essentially, because a samurai is ultimately, no matter what he chooses to do with his personal life, he is required to be a warrior and fight on behalf of his daimyo. If a samurai chooses to go against his daimyo, does something to offend his daimyo has the right to be able to execute him or call for him to kill himself. Harikiri, or there's a couple different terms for it, but essentially the other option is he can give him the choice to become Ronin, or may choose to purposely banish him as a Ronin. And basically think of it as a wandering knight, someone who has lost their land and no longer has a social place. People would know that you're a Ronin. You wouldn't be allowed to wear the colors that you used to wear. Typically your armor was stripped of you, and the only thing you typically kept was your katana, which was actually a handed down item typically. And so you would probably leave with the clothes on your back and your grandfather's sword, because that's who you inherited from.
Wow.
And if you were like the second son who did not get the grandfather's sword, you probably didn't even take a sword with you when you left. And you'd have to find your own swordsmith and have them craft something for you, which could be incredibly difficult because now you're at a social disadvantage and you have to work to make money, which you've never had to do before. So it's
right.
It's kind of an interesting angle to play. Some games make them less powerful, like Legend of the Five Rings is guilty of this. They make Ronin less powerful than their samurai counterparts, even though it's more of like a social outcast thing, not necessarily a power thing in my mind. And then where ninja come in, they're secret houses. They're groups of servants that work in the shadows that are unofficial, and they take care of the dirty work. Typically in Japanese culture, touching a dead body is considered a bad thing. A ninja is there to carry out such tasks, just as a commoner would. A lot of ninjas actually come from the commoner caste anyways. And in reality, what a ninja was a spy. And they were a social, charismatic person who would go out, and a lot of times they were farmers, and they would go farm until the land of your enemies and gather information for you. The romanticized ninja is the one that wears black pajamas and climbs on buildings, which in a role-playing game, that's the ninja you want to play most of the time. But it's kind of fun to play the typical like spy who is dressing as a commoner but has a lot of actual practical battle knowledge. If you look at the way that the ninja weapons were founded, a lot of them, like the kunai, is actually a farming implement that had been sharpened and used as a weapon ultimately. And so a lot of the ninja implements happen to come from their cultural background of the people who came from that area.
That's awesome. So that's really good high-level knowledge, because the way that in my Western mind, it's like exactly what you said. Ninjas are in black pajamas. They fight against the samurais, and Ronins are tough guy samurais who buck the system. Like, so your explanation is much more clear, and I do see those social overtones of it's a lot about your relationship to, what did you call it, a domo?
The daimyo would be.
Daimyo.
To think of it in kind of European terms, a daimyo would be something of like a count, whereas the emperor would be the equivalent of like a king.
Perfect. So let's talk about how this could look in the campaign world of Dragongrin. Because my original thought, until you described what a samurai really was, I thought that the samurai were going to be servants of these giant lords. Okay. However, how many daimos can there be for a house? Just one?
So typically there is one daimyo. There are circumstances that create opportunity to have a divided house where you'd fall under two daimyos. For example, let's say that the previous daimyo died and he had two children that are roughly the same age. They were born in the same year, but they're got that 9 months of difference. Technically, both children could fight for position of being the head of the clan, the daimyo now. Or possibly a samurai who has been in long service to the clan believes that he is more entitled to that position than the son of the previous daimyo, which could cause the house to divide into two minor houses while they have a internal civil war type thing, which may be bloody or just political. A lot of times it was traditionally done very bloodily, to be honest.
Sure. And that's kind of what I'm imagining. You know, I think because the idea is, what I wanted was to have, at first, each one of the types of giants to have, a different sort of clan, like you're saying. And I was thinking like, oh yeah, there's going to be these battles. It's going to be, and then I thought, the more I'm talking to you, the more I think that it's much more interesting if there's a lot more political intrigue. And going back to the very beginning of this conversation, it's interesting to me as a game master thinking of giants, just these enormous creatures following their own set of social customs about where you stand, where you can walk. I just think that that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to thinking about it after you kind of first brought it up, and you could take Bushido as written and use it for the giants, but I think almost that you'd want to maybe take a look at some of the words that go into Bushido and maybe change their context a little bit more to reflect like a giant culture. What I did want to point out real quick before we get too far from the ninja thing is Notorious White Moth has been on fire in the chat, and I did want to point out his last one here. Real ninjas usually wore navy blue. They were, again, freedom fighters, people oppressed by the Oda and Hideyoshi, who tried to free their communities through guerrilla tactics. That is the true origin of where ninjas came from in the most like common context where they got romanticized. They are people who are fighting for their own personal rights as human beings, and that's what makes them such an interesting historical character.
Yeah, I like that. And one of the things that I like to do anyway, is take that real history element. Where do they actually come from? What social thing birthed them? Because it's cool to romanticize things like the Wild West and ninjas, but you know, as real people, we're forged in the fires of conflict. And, you know, no one sets out to say, well, you know, heck, I want to be a big heckin' rebel. Like, there's a reason, there's oppression, like you're saying, and it's usually a way to free themselves and gain freedoms. I like to take that element and then marry it with some of the really high-level, awesome concepts of the romanticized version, and then mash them right in the middle to make something that is just attractive enough on the high concept, but gritty enough with the character and conflict. And that right there is what I think the ninjas of Dragongrin are going to be. A mixture of the black pajama wearing navy blue, like freedom fighters, and then those farmer spies. So I really like that information. So
yeah, absolutely. I would definitely use both contexts, actually. There's such thing as the idea of the house ninja, which is a person who is sworn to a specific house or a ninja clan in service. Ninja clans typically sided with either the cause that they believed was right or money. That's basically what it all boiled down to. So you could have the house ninjas, which would be your very obvious pajama wearing ninjas. And then you could have kind of your traditional peasants that are standing up for what they believe in and fighting against powers that they see as oppressive, which in this case sounds like it's probably going to be the giants. And I got to thinking about the giants. The really cool thing about the giants inside this thing is, to me, they feel like the way that daimos typically would. Like, for them, going to war is like playing a game of Go. They line up their army, they position it, they sit atop of hills, and give out commands, and basically they're playing a real-time strategy game with each other that is costing the lives of thousands of their followers.
I love it. That's exactly, as we've been talking, I have to say exactly that. The image I had was kind of a profile and one like fire giant sitting there, sort of leaned on some kind of, I don't know, thing, some sort of Asian inspired weapon. And then the other one, maybe more of an oafish, stupid sort of hill giant on the opposite. And, he's sort of like just watching, and they're both exactly what you're saying. They're watching their pawns march to war.
Oh, yeah.
I love that, man.
So one of the things that I sent you earlier this week that I wanted to talk about was there's a specific Japanese giant, Gashidokaru, who was I shouldn't say giant. It's an undead that is called a starving skeleton. If you've seen Kubo and the Two Strings, it's the kind of skeleton that was protecting the sword. It's basically people who have died in starvation, their bones coming together to form a giant skeleton. And I had this great idea that maybe that's one of the big concerns of the giants and why they take care of the people that they do. Because if these people die under their care, they're going to get giant skeletons that they have to deal with. So it's almost like they're taking care of those people so that they don't have to deal with this problem later on.
I love that. That's actually really awesome to me. And I haven't thought of the main conflict. No, not conflict, because I think the conflict would be, let me say this. I haven't thought of the point at which everyone is trying to strive, the goal, the thing that everyone wants, that resource. Or so in Asian culture, it does not seem like it was about sort of like the westernized version of like, yeah, you gotta make it, you gotta, get money, get paid, get gold, get treasure.
It's more about like doing what is expected of you and what is right, so that when you are reincarnated, you go into the next life, that you can be born of a better station. And the idea is, especially in like Chinese culture, that you can go through this reincarnation karmatic cycle, and eventually, if you were to do everything perfect, you could achieve divinity. And BJ Hall threw one in the chat. Oh goodness, where'd it go? Here it is. He put, they should be giants, but like he's saying, it would be awesome if they were rulers or even worshipped like the emperors were. But in secret, they are not divine. And this is what I think would be really cool for your giants, or at least the people of Reichen. The people of Reichen believe if they do what there's expected of them, that they follow the correct life path, that they will be first born as commoners, become the better class, and eventually move to samurai, and that a samurai who achieves greatness for his giant could one day be resurrected as a giant himself.
Yes, I love this. And
that's a great way to go about it.
That is absolutely what we're going to do. And here's the other thing. Let me tell you where the conflict is coming from. And I don't know which type of giants this will be. Maybe the fire giants. I don't know. Maybe that's a little too tropey. Here's what's happening. If it's all about going along the rails, doing what's expected, that's part of society, it's part of what's the norm. It is not okay because of this structure that you said, this would they call it reincarnation or no?
It depends on how you want to take it. It's typically referred to as like a karmatic cycle or reincarnation. Those are just kind of the westernized terms, and I would stick with those just because they're easy to recognize.
Totally. So you will say the karmatic cycle. It is not okay to resurrect a fallen giant. Once they're dead, you're supposed to leave them because it's part of the cycle, right? And so to me, I want that to be very important. However,
what I would do actually is, so there's the way China's empire started. There was originally there's the Yellow Emperor and the Jade Emperor, who's the emperor in heaven. The Yellow Emperor is the son of the Jade Emperor, and that when he ended his 175-year rule, he ascended to heaven. So technically he didn't die. What I think would be cool is if the giants secretly hid their dead. Like, you never saw a giant die because the giants would bury them into the mountains or send them off to sea when, like, in the middle of the night, and like drown the bodies. And maybe the bays, they're not very clean water, so you can't tell, but there's probably a giant's corpse at the bottom of the sea feeding the fishes right now.
That's phenomenal. And it also is because it would demystify their deification. It would demystify the idea that, like if you see a giant's dead body, they're not deities because, hey, they died.
Like one of the creation stories for the islands, because the creation stories are so important in myth, just in general, you could say that the islands were born of 100 giants that gave their lives for the people. And that immediately solidifies their divinity. And then if you stop showing giants dying to the people assume that the giants are returning to the heavens.
Oh, I love this.
It's really funny because if you look at the storm giants, if you use traditional D&D, they live in the cloud castle that's up in the sky, right?
Yep.
You could actually have that be a thing, and that when giants know that they're close to their natural death, so that they're not seen dying, they pass on their throne and they go to the Cloud King's castle, where they pass quietly outside of the view of mortals. Or at least
I love mortals. I love that. And so, all right, so here's the major conflict to me of Reichen. This is why there is turmoil, because I want there to be something that immediately upends the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So in D&D, you've got, like you said, you've got cloud giants, there's fire giants, there's hill giants, stone giants, storm giants, and frost giants.
Right.
All of those tend to fit in the same sort of biome, except for frost giants. Like cloud, fire, hill, stone, storm, that could exist in, Here's what I think.
Okay.
You're not supposed to know that the giants die. However, the frost giants are frost giants. They didn't used to be. Okay? Perhaps they're storm giants. Whatever. The point is, one of them died and was not supposed to be, the body was supposed to be hidden, everything. But someone broke tradition. Someone found out, or someone changed it and resurrected using very powerful resurrection magic. So this frost giant comes back, now having been beyond the veil,
mm-hmm.
and says, it's all a lie. I died, and it's awful on the other side. And he's basically he's come back, and he's raising an army of followers who are trying to go against tradition, and I would make them sort of the other faction, the non-believers, the tradition breakers.
I would definitely do that. The other thing that I would consider about your giants is, since we're talking about a Japanese influence culture for their basis, reskin your giants to the elements. Japanese elements are earth, air, fire, water, and void. So instead of having like storm giants, because climactically they don't make sense or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
You could say that they're void giants. And it works because those are the elements that are particularly understood and followed. And the cool thing is each faction, which, like, let's say the fire faction, represents intelligence, compassion, charisma, and they believe those things to be the correct, true way for things to be. They'll be directly opposed by the water, who believe that skill, intelligence, and strength are the things that you need to focus on, or whatever you want to make your elements focus on. And that'll put an immediate philosophical dichotomy between the 5 clans, because I don't know what dichotomy would be if you increase it to 5 instead of 2.
Right. No, I know. Right. And no, right? Trust me. So the idea, right. I love what you're saying.
The idea of the resurrected giant. And this is a good way for, you said you wanted the dismembered lord's fingers to be in all the pies.
Mm-hmm.
The dismembered lord could be the one who resurrected the giant. Not
exactly what I was going to say.
Not that it's public knowledge, but let's say the dismembered lord has a purpose for coming to Reichen. And let's say it's a rare material that can only be mined in Reichen. And the giants have so much of it that they don't really think anything of it. And maybe it's an alchemical material that's important for making phylacteries or something like that. Whatever the case is, that's something that the GM should understand, but maybe not the players. And his whole reason for resurrecting this giant is, this is a giant that maybe he had interacted with through life and had philosophical debates about what life and death actually were. And then to prove his point in the argument, he turns around and resurrects the giant to say, I told you there's nothing left for you.
That would be amazing
And the
because
giant immediately swears his allegiance to the dismembered lord.
exactly. And I love that. And the idea is that it's also the dismembered lord knows what he's doing. I mean, if you want to upend a culture and make it so that there's civil unrest so that they can't be shored up and prepared to fight back if there's a war, make it so that there's a tumultuous clash of culture and tradition. Here's the other thing.
So in the chat, I saw that somebody said that they wanted a giant lich. I would say take it the other direction, make him a death knight.
Oh, geez. Oh, my gosh. Like a huge...
think about it. If the dismembered lord could make the perfect soldier that he can march anywhere in the world he needs to, a giant death knight sounds terrifying.
Yeah,
especially if he's like a storm giant or something that's already pretty terrible to face, and then you slap Death Knight on top of him. So now he's doing like storm magic, finger of death nonsense, and swinging like an 8 to 12 foot katana at people. Yeah, it's just a mess.
I would love that. I would love the fact that, and you would know this giant would come, just crushing across the countryside. Just like,
and that was one of the things that I wanted to mention is Japanese culture between samurai. A duel is considered a very honorable thing, but it's also considered very honorable to decline a duel. So like if you and I were having an argument and it came down to it that I wanted to prove that I was right, I could prove that with divine right by challenging you to a duel. If I won, that means I was right. If you won, that means you were right. And I would have to accept that as that's what the spirits, the gods, or whatever the faith is of the region, deemed it correct, that they led your hand to victory over me. I feel like if the giants were to duel, because of how important their people are to them, and the fact that they don't want these starving skeletons running around all over the place, that they would have like certain islands that are specifically designed, like a bigger island that is solely meant for duels.
The center island. The center island is a neutral zone that is just for basically those duels.
Yeah, definitely.
You can't spill blood unless it is a formal duel. Like you can't fight, you can't skirmish, you can't backstab. Now, of course, the giants that I would think would have come back from the dead, and I don't know much about this, I'll look more into it, but it makes sense that this is where the void element comes from.
Definitely. The void is all about the space between the elements and the universe. And so I think that the void giant, whichever one you reskin to be your void giant, would actually be the prime target for it.
Perfect. And I think that they wouldn't be following these rules. So they're being dishonorable. They're spilling blood where it shouldn't be spilled and so on.
Considering what the void represents, I think they'd be the most susceptible to the dismembered lord's conversations about what death actually means.
Yeah, I love it. No, it makes perfect sense. The other thing is that, you talked about this, and I'm going to kind of like what you said, go the other direction with a Death Knight versus a Lich. I'm going to go the other direction with the element or the resource that would be in Raikkogen. I don't think it's a metal or an element or something like that. I would love it if it's something that translated into the common tongue is the wheat of forever. It's basically this wheat that can grow almost anywhere, so it's a food source that can grow in desolate. I mean, basically the only place it can't grow is in frozen areas. But the Dismembered Lord is a forward-thinking, intelligent tactician. What kills an army? Lack of supplies.
Absolutely.
If you had wheat that could grow anywhere, and a soldier could carry a bag that is the size of your fist full of seeds and eat for months, you can never be sieged. You can, I think he would be interested in that. And I think I would want to make, and help me out with this, I would want to make it some sort of, it's not okay to either give it away to foreign people or maybe
that could just be a policy that the giants do not want to trade it because like historically it's dictated that this is the meal of the giants, the divinity. So mortal men don't eat this food. They don't trade it to outsiders. It's literally only the food of the giants. It's ambrosia, essentially. And you could do it like that. And
I love it.
BJ Hall had a great idea for your battleground, calling it the Eye of the Elements.
Ooh, that's awesome. I think I have a clearer picture than ever of what this is going to look like in Dragongrin and how this all works. And yeah, I think that's really cool. Is there any other thoughts you had? Anything you kind of wanted to, throw out there or talk more about?
Yeah, absolutely. So it totally depends on. This is kind of breaking away from Dragongrin, just talking about.
Sure, absolutely, man. Yeah.
But it totally depends on the kind of game that you want to play as far as what tropes really sell it. Like if you wanted a Wuxia or Chinese influence game, thinking about things like the astrology, the idea of divinity through Chinese fortune telling and things like that. Martial arts becomes more important in Chinese stories. If you look at Korean stories, it's more about swordsmanship, but martial arts is considered to hold hands almost with swordsmanship schools, that you don't just learn the sword, you also learn martial arts, and that kind of thing. And inside a game as a player, what you could definitely do is do stuff like, I wanted to play a monk that used a spear, and to make him feel more of an Asian type character, I just used the 5th edition monk. I was going with Way of the Four Elements, and he carried a spear, and his style was Fist of the Unicorn, is what I was calling it. And his spear was to act as a unicorn's horn, so when he charged, he would do stuff like swoop up the spear like a unicorn would gore at its opponent. Think about, because Chinese martial arts, when it's based on an animal or a creature, it's more an imitation of how that creature moves. So you can easily imitate that through your gameplay with just good use of description and thinking about how your character works on a mechanical level than necessarily what the game has flavored for you. I think a great martial artist that a lot of people don't think about because they're concerned about having different schools of martial arts is actually the Battle Master. The Battle Master has so many different moves available to it. Like, you want to knock somebody prone? Well, that's a sweep. You want to push somebody back? That's a bull rush. But in the Battle Master, you've got 2 moves that already accomplish that. You could also do it through uses of feats and things like that. One of the things that I would like to see is maybe a fighting style that's designed towards unarmed combat. And I'm trying to decide for my own game what would be considered overkill and what might be considered fair. Like, I kind of want to say, if you take the unarmed fighting style, you get a D6 for your unarmed strikes instead of the 1 plus strength that you get right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's
then it makes it a viable weapon, because anything less than a D4 typically is not a viable choice because of the way D&D mechanics work.
Sure, and that makes sense. And so let's pop open the hood a little bit here. So this is going to get a little mechanical, but for me, I love mechanics, but I think something that I am okay with that a lot of game masters aren't is I am okay with a full reskinning to match any style and flavor. Now, some would argue, well, that takes away from the monk and that takes away from it. It's like, hey, listen, if you want to put in the work to reskin anything, if you want to reskin a rogue as a ninja, and you just tell me that you're not using a dagger, but that you're using your fists, I will probably come up with a fluff term. Like, I would call it your fist of the dagger, so that I know that you're using your sneak attack and your weapon versus the mechanical equivalent of what would be an unarmed strike.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you and I talked about for a game where I wanted to play a monk that was a monk rogue, that his whole fighting style was to attack pressure points, and that's how we justified unarmed strikes doing sneak attack damage.
Exactly. And so because I love digging into mechanics, don't get me wrong, and I would love to talk shop with you sometime and really work out how the D6 would work and how it would scale up on through different levels. But I just want to encourage everyone that the mechanics of 5th edition are such that they all work, they all have a very unique flair and flavor, and it would be cool to see how you could reskin the different classes very creatively. Like, I love what you just said, the pressure points. It makes sense. That's a sneak attack. We've all seen in the movie where someone gets hit right there on the side and they freeze up, That's really cool, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of reskinning things. I've mentioned it on my channel that if you find me on Facebook and you're like, hey, I really want to make this concept, how would you do it? If you wanted to chalk chop with me, as long as it's a system I know, I will be more than happy to kind of play with it and come up with an idea that I think captures the spirit of what you're going for, rather than like, okay, you have to be a monk because you're a martial artist.
Totally agree with that. And you know what? I haven't said this yet, and it's my fault. I'm a bad host. Subscribe to Drop Dice. If you're watching this video, go to Drop Dice's channel. You know what, Chris? If you can you put in that folder a subscribe like doc where they could just go to your channel, or like the subscribe link. But subscribe, because Chris has a lot of really good live games in this style. He's got a lot of sort of vlog videos where he discusses different concepts and things like that. I'm a fan of your channel. So I would say to anybody who's subscribed to Tabletop Terrors, go and check out Drop Dice. And this, I think this hangout has proven, he knows what he's talking about in a lot of things. And I know, Chris, you're very mechanical too. So take advantage of that. Ask him questions, hit him up with, on his Facebook and that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, absolutely. For anybody that wants to get a hold of that stuff right now, I do have a website. It's just dropdice.com. It's got a campaign page for my last L5R game. And this is one of the things that I did want to talk to you about, Tim, because this is one of the things that you told me a long time ago when you were watching L5R that you really liked, to kind of remind you of it. Writing letters is really important in Legend of the Five Rings. So for my characters, the way they do episode recaps at the beginning is I have them write letters, and they get bonus experience for doing so, to a family member or a friend. And basically during the next game, they read their letter that they sent away. So the interesting part about that is if they write a letter about something that they can't talk about because of social norms. So the letter may sound very strange because they're trying to hint at what happened, but they can't say exactly what happened. There's a really great example of it in my L5R game where Tom's character wrote a letter home to his master and tried to tell his master that basically there's this thing called the Lying Darkness, which is basically, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, The Shadow, the Lying Darkness is basically the shadow. And it's something that socially you don't talk about. You would never put it in a letter because you'd be afraid that the letter would be intercepted by somebody else. So the whole letter is like this flowery speech where he's kind of beating around the bush about what happened when everything went bad. They found out the Lying Darkness is alive and doing stuff in the world again. And it's hilarious.
And that's such a cool thing to do, to add a layer of roleplay.
Absolutely.
I think that having your characters, especially taking the time to write a letter, I mean, that's a commitment as a player, but doing it in such a way that isn't just phoning it in, but saying, all right, how do I tell my master that there is an evil without evil knowing that I've realized it? And I'm saying, like, dear mom, there is a shadow under my bed. I love that.
The one thing that I did want to point out is the Pretender's been talking about some different religions and things like that.
Sure,
those are great things to add to your games, like Shinto. I'm actually a Taoist myself, so I'm a fan of Taoist religion inside my games because it's a lot to do with karmatic cycle and dead things staying dead, which is a cool element that you can pretty much play in any Asian genre because dead things are bad when they come back, no matter where you go.
Right. Right, like there's no hey, take me to a good guy cleric and resurrect me.
Oh yeah, that doesn't happen.
It's like when you come back, it's like, no, you're tainted. You're bad. There's no way you can be good.
It's so extreme, like Legend of the Five Rings being one of my favorite setting pieces. It's Japanese influenced. There is no resurrection spell. There is technically a way to resurrect someone, but it takes 5 casters from a very specific family in a very specific clan to cast the spell. And there's a good chance that all 5 will die, bringing just you back.
Wow.
So nobody wants to do it ever.
Right. So it would have to be world altering, or you'd have to be very important. And this is what the Pretender says in the chat here. He said, like in Shinto, is how it's pronounced? Shinto. There's the concept of purity that doesn't match with the Christian form of purity. And most monsters are a result from a lack of purity. So he says he can imagine that the druids would be representing sort of this natural purity, rather than the natural balance of nature, if it makes sense. And that makes perfect sense, Pretender. That's amazing.
And that's one of the things that I did want to encourage you about when you go to do your monster section. I think you captured it really well when you did the starvation book that you worked with Nate on.
Yep.
Having monsters that come about because of problems with society and things like that. Like there's a fantasy explanation for goblins that nobody uses that I love. In German folklore, a goblin is a child that got left in the woods and forgotten about by his parents.
Oh, snap.
And the goblin can actually be scared away by spraying it with breast milk. Which is kind of like this weird law. It's like this super weird lore thing. But if you look at like Japanese culture, a kappa is a water spirit that has a bowl of water in its head. And if you ever see one without the water in its head, it's probably going to try and kill you because it's completely irritated. It's dehydrated. It will die. And basically it's fighting for on its last legs. There's the idea of the woman that died during pregnancy and never got to see her child because the child died in the process. She's basically an upper torso, and she kidnaps children from pregnant women because she wants her own baby.
Wow.
But she takes them when they're too young, and she can't care for them, so they just keep dying.
Oh, wow. That is a really twisted lore that adds in a lot of elements. Built-in plot hooks abound.
And I would definitely center your monsters around the idea of writing them with plot hooks built in, and you guys are really good about that. I've read other stuff that you guys put together through Absolute Tabletop and everything, and you guys are very story focused, which is why I love doing reviews on the products that you guys do and stuff like that. Because that's what gets me for role playing. Like I will have entire sessions where we don't touch dice, we just talk about what's going on in the story, and I'm totally fine with that.
100%. And you know, one of the things is that, and this is sort of to go onto like monsters, one of the things we were toying with is we do want to come out with a monster book at some point for Dragongrin. And one of the things I like personally is when the monsters are divided up in certain ways. I love alphabetizing them. Don't get me wrong. But having what we were talking about is have the classic alphabetized version of all the monsters. And that's fine, and that's easy for looking up and the very practical side. But then the back of the book is a series of maps. And the maps would have locations where these monsters were more prevalent. And bits of lore and habitat and stuff like that, so that you can flip through and have your normal kind of thing. But if you want to go to Reichen, you open that up, and there's a little map of Reichen, and it shows you, like, hey, here are the creatures that are there. Here's where they live. Here's how they work. Here's kind of the story and the plot hooks, and here's the... So you have your... And the reason why we wanted to do it that way, instead of just by region, is because if I was looking for something alphabetically, I'd be pulling my hair out.
What I would do is label your map with codes like Reichen. You could say R1, 2, 3, etc. And then on the monsters entry, put location, give basically it's a grasslands, and then put in parentheses afterward R2, R3, showing that those are predominant locations where they show up.
That's perfect. And we are going to make it so that exactly what you said, like grasslands, so that people can use them in any system, any setting. But hey, here's where they live in Dragongrin. So yeah, there'll definitely be strong story elements. And, you know, too, it'd be cool to just pop out 5 or 6 or 10 monsters specific to a region after the Dead Man's Guide is out, and just say, hey, you know, people have been playing in this region. Let's put some monsters out with an Oriental flair. That brings up something
you might want to check out is, if you get a chance, the Legend of the Five Rings: Enemies of the Empire. Essentially, how it's broken down inside there. It's a monster manual essentially, but it's done by faction instead of by alphabetized. So like, if you go to the Lying Darkness, it talks about everything that the Lying Darkness is, who follows it, who fights for it, and why they do. And then you go to another one that talks about like Ronin, and it talks about who the Ronin are, the different Ronin factions. And then you go down to another one, and it's the Oni. And it basically breaks it down by, these are the common threats you see, and this is why they are. And I think that's a really good way to organize a story-focused monster manual.
No, I agree with that very, very much, because the story is, what are their goals? What are they fighting for? What are they doing? And that sort of segues into something else I want to talk about. And are you good on time?
Yeah, I'm totally fine.
Cool, because we're gonna keep going, guys. I mean, I'll just keep rocking and rolling.
Yeah, I mean, Mini Terrain just got here, so we got to go for like at least another hour for him. Right?
Totally. So I've been really bad. I haven't been going into the chat, and I've been trying to work on that because people are smarter than me, and they're writing amazing things in the chat, and then the chat doesn't save when when the video is published. So unfortunately. So, which Facebook, please.
There's actually been some good discussion about tattoos and the culture about how they were used for punishment, and that they were later adopted as ranking structures for like Yakuza and things like that.
Mm-hmm. That's
if
cool.
you want to have a criminal element in your world, you could stick with that, and then it would actually be really cool, because think about the Copper Jackals. The Copper Jackals, all of them kind of look like tattooed bikers from Fantasy Realm, basically.
Right, yeah.
So imagine if a Copper Jackal comes there and he goes, you don't want to deal with the Dismembered Lord. He's a terrible person. But everybody on that island looks at this tattooed up Copper Jackal that's got like metal veins across his face. And they're like, no, we don't want to deal with you. That guy at least looks human.
Right. I love that. I love that it's more about decorum or specific expectations, and a tattoo, like you said, it's like, oh, okay, you purposefully branded yourself as a common criminal. Like, there's no honor in that. Notorious White Moth in the chat has been continuously killing it. I don't know who you are, but you are very versed in this topic. And you have to forgive my pronunciation. If I say it wrong, correct me, anybody. It says, the Miko would be a druid/bard hybrid. In my Zipangu setting, purification would be an important part of an overall campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Pretender says, and like the druid demands that you wash yourself with nature. Like taking a stroll in a bamboo forest is considered a bath. So it's like really focusing on the folklore and the elements of the nature around them and respecting it. I think that's really neat.
That's definitely one thing that I focus on in a lot of my games. Like L5R, it's already built in for me, but the idea of maintaining a pure, balanced, and focused soul. So like if you were to kill someone, you don't just put your sword away. You seek out a shrine so that you can wash it in shrine waters that have been blessed by a priest. Or if there's nothing like that, you find a pure white cloth so that you can clean your blade before sheathing it.
That's
Little
awesome.
minor things like that, so that you can maintain the idea of your character is being pure. Like one of my character concepts that I really want to play that I haven't found a good game for is I want to make a swordsman who doesn't take life, because there's this great rule in 5th edition that nobody pays attention to that says that if you deal enough damage to kill someone, you can choose to instead spare their life. And I want to make a swordsman that never chooses to kill anyone, regardless of the circumstances, and eventually has to come through with the decision of, do I have to kill this person? The Batman Joker complex.
Sure.
How many times am I going to let this person go, and that he kills thousands of people because I failed to kill him?
I love that. And that, that reminds me of an anime that I've seen, which is Rurouni Kenshin, or Samurai X. One of my all-time favorite animes. And I love that theme of someone being powerful enough to take the life, but choosing not to, like you're saying. That's so strong regarding a role play element that you can really factor in there. So that's really awesome, man. I'd like to see that at some point. Maybe you could play that person in Raikkogen.
It's possible.
It's possible. So I'll continue to keep an eye on the chat. But one of the things...
There was actually a really good comment inside here. They were talking about, because we were talking about the tattoos, imagine the lakes that would have to be filled with ink to tattoo the giants. Wouldn't that be great if they're like, literally, the giant has committed a crime because your lord is being escorted off by 2 other giants from his own clan, and he's being pinned to a mountainside while a 3rd giant dips a needle, which is basically the size of a skyscraper, to hammer into the back of the new criminal. That
is amazing.
That would be an amazing way to start a campaign. Your lord is lost and being branded as a traitor right now. What do you guys want to do?
Everyone's a Ronin, or they have to fight for their lord, right? I mean, isn't that how that would go?
Or they have to side with a new lord as the nation descends into civil war.
Oh my gosh. So I love this, and here's the other thing, because I like the fact that not just in war do these giants affect these people as pawns, because that is awful as it stands, but in everyday life. Think about how grueling it would be, because ink dries up, ink hardens. It doesn't just stay a lake.
Oh yeah, it's going to be terrible for the region around it. So where these lakes are, it's got to be completely screwed from like any sort of like vegetation around it for a while.
And if
like Notorious White Moth just mentioned it, India ink, which is the kind of ink that you use for tattoos or for fine paintings, it's soot and glue. Soot and glue put into a lake is just not a good recipe for the land around it.
That's what I'm thinking, is that you have all of your servants making this glue. They have to make it for the ritual. Imagine the hellacious job.
The fact that you got to slaughter entire hordes of horses just to get the glue.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying. There would be I'm sure they would probably find some sort of animal.
Oh, they'd use pig probably.
Right.
It'd be the easiest thing.
And think about this, and this all just to me screams very Asian influence, where it's like they just have these droves of pigs that are just for glue. They're not good enough to eat, or they're set aside, and there's people who are like, well, now I'm being Western in my way. They'd probably just do it and not complain, but...
I mean, you probably complain inside your head like, oh, geez, we got to slaughter 4,000 pigs and prepare glue today. And you know that's going to be your task for the next 4 weeks just to get the glue ready.
Right.
For the ink, which is going to ruin one of your lakes when it's done.
Right. And so let's just kind of continue down this path just to help people kind of bring this to their table and the thinking and the mentality of this. Let's say that a lord named, I don't know, give me a name of a lord who has broken the laws and will be tattooed.
Let's see.
Maybe use 20,000 names.
Let's go to the chat. Anybody want to name the lord?
Yeah, name the lord. Who is the giant lord who is a criminal and is going to be inked? He's going to be tattooed.
I forgot. We got to give it like 10 seconds, don't we?
I think so.
Harambe. I'm not going with that. Sorry.
Why is that? I don't know what that is.
Harambe is that gorilla that the kid was in the cage with, and they shot him.
Oh, that's that was in the Cincinnati Zoo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So while they're thinking of that, I want to kind of tell you this thought process I'm having. So let's say, how about Jake just named him Lord Herathron?
That's fine. Lord Herathron.
So Lord Herathron.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I'm thinking, and you tell me culturally. This lord knows that he has broken the rules enough to get this tattoo. So let me put you on the spot, Chris. What is something that he could have done to get this inking?
So because he's a giant, I doubt he's going to be any of the petty crimes that would get him a tattoo would be one of the things I don't think he's going to go out and steal, which would get him a tattoo and branded as a criminal. But I think he might be the head of some assassination plot against another tribe of giants to get a estranged friend of his into power with those giants. So he now has an ally with the Fire Clan.
Love it. Perfect. Knowing this and knowing that it takes at least, like you said, like a week or 4 weeks or however long, would this lord sit in his palace waiting for this judgment?
He would probably wait for it, knowing that it was probably coming. Like for a while, he'd probably be like proud and assume that he's going to get away with it. But once he knows the jig is up, he's probably going to have to sit for a little bit while they get together to arrest him. But once he's arrested, he's probably going to have to sit in a jail, probably in like a Storm King's Castle type of situation, away from the people for a month or more, and then they'll bring him back to the ground to be branded in front of the people to reinforce that no matter what your station is, that law will be carried out.
That's crazy. I love that. And so most traditionally, not everyone, because a character can make their own choices, but most traditionally would, without fighting, go to the castle, wait, serve out their days, come back down, and without fighting, be branded.
Mm-hmm.
That's more common than what, to me, a very European or Western hero, like, that's the beginning of the adventure. Like, hey, you've been caught. What are you going to do? And they're like, well, I'm going to fight, or I'm going to run. You know?
Oh, yeah, and they could definitely do that. Or they could somebody said, imagine that as a quest, though. The giant of your element appears and requisitions a new tattoo on their bicep. The party has to fashion the appropriate tools. Like, you have to go out and find the tusk of a mammoth to be the tattoo needle or something ridiculous.
I love that. That's pretty sick.
This is one thing that we had not talked about. It just came up in here, talking about the dragons being involved with tattooing giants. That could definitely be a thing. Keep in mind that dragons are kind of different inside Asian culture. Instead of being a thing that is feared, they're a thing that's respected and seen as a creature of wisdom and intelligence. So typically they wouldn't actually be enemies. They would be things that you would seek out for sage advice. So it kind of puts the dragon in kind of a new, unique position for players that are more used to like a traditional fantasy element. You're not going to be on a quest to kill a dragon. You might be on a quest to capture the laughter of a dragon so that you can resurrect your fallen love.
Wow. Yeah.
Which sounds crazy because you're like, how do you capture laughter? Well, that's part of the problem.
Yeah, right. And that's part of the mysticism element, that the fantastical nature that is kind of tied to all this. And that segues well into something that I wanted to hit on, and we touched it a little bit, but one of the topics that I think is important is the creatures, the monsters, and the folklore of this culture, I feel is very different and has a very unique tone. And so I think a good place to start, it's kind of starting at the top, but since we're on the subject of dragons, we'll talk about dragons.
Mm-hmm.
I know in our campaign world of Dragongrin, the dragons that were around were not great. But I love the idea that there would be a remnant of Reichen dragons. They're not around now. It's very, very rare for dragons to be around in Dragongrin. Dragongrin in our campaign setting, Grin is another word for graveyard. And so it's essentially the whole realm is the dragon's graveyard. But tell me, how are Asian dragons depicted in, are there dragons in L5R and stuff like that?
Yeah, there's multiple dragons, especially if you look at Chinese culture. The Long, which is the traditional imperialist dragon, the serpentine kind of style one. And then there is also a proto-dragon, which is... It looks very similar to the serpentine flying dragon, but it does not have the ability to fly. They fly without wings on the currents of magic, essentially. The proto-dragon has to do things for the good of mankind and Earth to achieve true dragon state. However, if it chooses a selfish path and chooses to seek out glory and things like that, it turns into a different kind of dragon, which is kind of... it would be like the European equivalent of a wyvern. It's like a twisted dragon. And they actually look like European dragons do. They sprout wings, they have limited flight capability, and they stay quadrupedal for the most part.
So that would be interesting, because I like the idea that these dragons are pure. They're some of the good dragons. Maybe, perhaps, unless I can, think of another reason why, in the campaign world of Dragongrin, where evil has won, and a long time ago the dragons were weapons of evil, perhaps these are the only good dragons. There's no sight or traces of your classically good dragon.
Keep it with the kind of rare quality that dragons have in the world. Like, maybe there's only a handful of them left, like maybe one of each element, or something like that. And the other thing too is the dragon turtle, which is already in the 5th edition monster manual. That is a Chinese dragon. It comes purely from Chinese lore. It was later carried over and passed into European tradition as a type of sea monster, but that's where its origin story is.
Nice.
That's what they believed typically sea monsters were. They didn't really have a kraken concept. They had sea turtles and disappearing islands.
That's awesome. And so I think that needs to live there around the coasts, dragon turtles and perhaps disappearing islands. To me, thinking, in a practical sense, in fantasy nautical navigation, if you're looking, obviously you're going to use your bearings, but not everybody's going to have those tools.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to use the stars, but if these disappearing islands were giving you false landmarks, you'd have to be much more careful to follow the stars and follow your charts, because you could be sailing and then 2 hours later the island is gone that you were using as you're heading, and it's over in a different part of the horizon. So I think that would kind of be cool too, where it's difficult unless you know that they're disappearing islands to navigate into Reichen without having some sort of experience.
That was actually one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. Let me find the term again here. Kunibiki is a concept that I told you I wanted to talk about because I think it's really cool for the giants. Kunibiki, literally translated, means land pulling. There's a Japanese story where basically a man was rejected from one empire, and to be kind of an asshole, he turned around and said, well, if you won't give me that land, I'm going to use my rope and I'm going to pull it to my borders and I'm going to take that land. What if Kunibiki was a real thing in Reichen? The giants literally pulled islands to create larger land masses. When they won a war, they would pull an island closer to their islands that they have dominion over.
That's sick. I think that it also would go to the sort of like the tradition and all that, where it's like you have to watch an island get pulled away from you, essentially, if you don't keep it.
And think about it, like, because typically islanders, if the islands are close enough, you may be used to just taking a small boat, like a fishing vessel, between islands and visiting family that's on one island. Well, that island lost in the war, now your family's being completely moved. It takes 3 days for you to travel to them, and you got to fill out paperwork and get the appropriate permissions to go to that island because now they're part of another nation.
That's sick. That's crazy. I love that. And again, those political things immediately cause character conflict. And talk about backstory built in. It's like a really good place to start as a character in this kind of setting where you have so much tied to your society and your lineage. Like you said, that fast your lineage changes. Not literally, but the land you're a part of now. You're serving what was your, if nothing else, your neutral
or possibly an enemy.
Right. I was going to say, if nothing else, like neutral competition, but probably an enemy. That would be way better.
And because of the social structure and what's encouraged for you for the norms, you have to simply toe the line, follow into the norms, and respect your new lord.
Yeah, I love that. And BJ Hall in the chat says, one island is really an old dragon turtle that is put to sleep or controlled by one of the giants. Super old and known only as a myth to regular folks.
I think that would be cool if that was the dueling island in the center.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's actually really cool.
Like, the giants don't typically duel on this unless it's a real matter that they need to settle as a duel. Like, they don't want to spend the human lives to do it. They'll finally go and fight on the turtle because they don't want to risk waking the turtle.
Dude, I love that. And the other thing, too, is that they don't want the people seeing them fighting. The gods should be above that. But occasionally they need to do this, So I think that's fantastic. A lot of really, really good stuff in the chat. Notorious White Moth still doing, like, just murderous work on some of these thoughts he's having, or she. He says, while we're talking about dragons, I feel like I should bring up, is it Quillin? Quilin? A draconic divine beast with antlers of lightning and a mane of fire. That's so gentle, its tread won't leave hoof prints.
That is a Chinese creature. It's Qilin. It's the Chinese unicorn, sort of.
I love that.
It's got a very unique description to it. I actually did a Mythic China game where that was one of the bad guys, was how it turned out, because he became possessed by an evil spirit, and the players did not realize it, and they accidentally killed it. And the story ended on a tragic note that while they saved everyone from this beast that was seeking revenge, they took something very special from the world. They essentially killed the last unicorn, if you would. And it left off with the note that it could be resurrected if you were to achieve certain things, like go retrieve the phoenix from the emperor, which is considered an auspicious sign in China, meaning that emperor is the correct divine ruler. Things like that. Like Japanese culture, the heron has the same basic idea of the phoenix inside Chinese culture, that if a white heron specifically, is seen during that emperor's reign, that it's considered that he is divinely the correct emperor. And I think that maybe that should have an aspect, like maybe not necessarily a white heron, but a white rock, for example, or
Sure.
maybe a white dragon, since they're so rare. That if a dragon was to make their appearance, that means the current person who is acting as the Storm King, the Emperor, is the correct one. So every other giant has to just listen to what he says because the heavens have acknowledged him. Because
Yeah.
ultimately, there should be somebody who's in charge of them that just lives in the heavens, that has a very even divinity sake to even the giants that are on the islands.
I love that. And the adventure begins, or the campaign begins. No, the campaign begins before with the giant tattoo. But the end of the first session is the void giant has caused certain effects to happen, basically manufactured this dragon appearing, whether it's by capturing or whatever, so that at least for a time, everyone has to listen to these awful tradition breakers.
Oh yeah, it would be like a great turn of events if you found out that the giant had this thing imprisoned in the castle and it just released it and then drug it back into the castle to be imprisoned again, just as a show.
That would be great. I love that. And talking about the scarcity of the dragons, BJ Hall had a really cool comment. He said, the tattoo ink for these giants could be made by the blood of a certain dragon, depending on the type of tattoo and the reason involved. I think that that's a cool idea. And what it makes me think of is these dragons we're talking about, I think they should be so rare that there is, as you said, one of each, but they are named. It's not like, oh, it's the proto-dragon. It's like, no, that is, Ushiwa.
I'm a big fan of the mythic creatures feeling mythic. Like, I don't want 14 red dragons in the country unless there's a reason for 14 red dragons. And if there are, they should have names. They should have stories. They should have social weaknesses that could be preyed upon by a clever player. Things like that.
Yeah, and I think that the scarcity keeps their mysticism up, especially in this kind of a setting.
Yeah.
So what else have we not covered that you feel like, hey, if you're going to be running an Asian-inspired D&D or tabletop RPG, one of the things we haven't covered is X. Is there anything we've missed that we really need to hit on?
Not really. We kind of talked about the respect thing. The respect, even if you don't use like the naming suffixes, should be present inside the game, that you should respect your elders, the people of higher station, people who have been practicing a certain art longer than you, that sort of thing, and how that respect can be used in a negative connotation too. But where I think you can push it a little bit more is words should have potence in a game like that. They should have a power behind them. Like a certain turn of phrase, which sounds very innocent, could actually mean absolutely everything. And it could be a very negative connotation thing, even though you said the soup is satisfying. By saying it was satisfying, you may actually be insulting the cook, having underlining context. And I think that's more of a player trick, because once your players start to kind of get into this idea of back-talking everything, some really clever RP happens. And you get to chuckle at yourself and the players because you're like, oh man, I can't believe he insulted that Daimo right in front of him. Like there's really good examples in my Legend of the Five Rings campaign where like Murdoch's character has straight insulted the clan he went to learn from. He insulted the Daimo in front of him 100%, and that Daimo is the kind that you can get away with that sort of thing so long as you're not too extravagant with it. Because it was a closed room, it was only them in there, the Daimo ignored it and moved on. But like other situations, you might get killed for doing something like that.
That's great. And so I love that. I love that the intricacies socially of what you just described can be an entire hour of gameplay. Like, and to some that might sound boring, but it's a good mix, I think, of having to really think about what your character's doing when the game master or the dungeon master says, "What are you doing?" You can't just go, "I don't know. Is there a shop in town?" you've got to think about what you're doing. And even just that exercise, I think, is good flexing of that muscle for roleplay.
And one of the things that I did want to touch upon is just that the idea of a hero is different in Asian stories. Heroism is not necessarily protecting like a single person or a village, or it's more of like a grand scale thing. Like heroism is giving your life for your country, not necessarily defeating the corruptor, but the fact that you saved all these people from the corruptor. It's just a different context. It's the same task. It's just holds a different meaning.
No, I love that. And so if you were to give people maybe some examples, how could I think of this as a character who wanted to try to think of this mindset on a standard D&D adventure? We used a big scale, like fight the big bad for your country, but on a session-to-session basis, if I want this flavor in my campaign, what's one or two easy things that I can do to try to act like that?
So I mentioned earlier, names are super important. I'd say start with your name. Have an idea culturally of what you're shooting for, and think about the mannerisms that go with it. Because like I said, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Indian, all the different Asian cultures have little different intricacies about them. So maybe watching some movies that are inside a genre that's specific to that country will help you out with thinking about how mannerisms work, or even the clothing options that you wear. I'm a big fan of thinking about what characters wear, because if you look at Japanese culture, it's very neutral, dour colors, a lot of earth tones and things like that. Whereas if you look at Chinese culture, the more lavish and like truer your colors are, like a red, which is a hard color to get out of silk, or purples and things like that. That means you have wealth and things like that. In Korean cultures, red was actually a very common color because of the minerals that they had in the area. They could make red dyes very cheaply and easily. So that became one of the important colors to like the military. Same with blues there. And thinking about things like that really reinforce your character to fit the setting that you're going for. Beyond that, I would look at what is expected of your social class, because that's really where your character is going to feel like they fit or don't fit. If you're a samurai, you're expected to be fair, if not a little harsh, about following the law and making sure that those under your care are protected. You, like, for example, if you have a thief in the party and you know that they're a thief, as a samurai, you may say something like, "We don't steal from those that should not be stolen from," something simple and blanket term like that. And what you're basically telling the thief is, don't steal from those that will hurt from doing it. Or you may encourage the thief to not steal from anybody who's alive, because taking from a dead body is different than stealing from a living person, which may get you in the problem that your thief becomes an assassin and just so justify his treasure hunting needs. But
I was thinking that. I thought, yeah, but again, that is a cool place to find conflict. Like, that's just a neat idea. What happens when that assassin or that thief, that thief turned assassin, begins to realize that, hey, I'm following the letter of the law.
Yes.
It's okay for me to kill. And technically.
That's one of the things, too, is a lot of, especially Japanese stories, it's about questioning if the law is correct as well. So your companion, the thief who decides to start becoming an assassin so that he can justify his thieving, it is really cool, because then your samurai character has to then question, is he using the law for a purpose that it's not intended to? How do you correct this? Can you show him the way back to being pure and enlightened again? Or is he forever doomed and you have to do something about it?
I love that. So many cool overtones. So I think just a couple more questions that kind of have come up as we're talking. The first one is, how often do you use Wikipedia or something to just pop on there and say, okay, this is correct, or this is, how accurate is that? And I know it sounds silly to say how accurate is Wikipedia, but.
So all the time. I am like the biggest fan of Wikipedia ever. I love all wikis of all forms. If I can read stuff and absorb information about anything that I plan on playing and use those tropes to make my character more believable, I'll play to them. Like I love desert campaigns, so I make characters that feel very desert dweller. I do things like I make sure and take bits of cactus with me. That way I can cut them open and drink them later, that sort of thing. And I think stuff like that is just really good for both players and GMs, that if you know a game's coming up, like my favorite thing to do is tell my players about a month ahead before the campaign starts and say, hey, we're going to play L5R. Here's a wiki. Here's the 5 articles I think you guys really should read before we start. And then you guys can read anything else you want. I would suggest you read about your clans and the current timeline. Those are the main things that I want you to be concerned with, because L5R has an immense background. So if you get too broad with it, it's overwhelming for players.
Sure.
So usually I give them stuff like, okay, here's the most recent war. Here's what etiquette is. Here's the stuff about the clans that are going to be involved right at the beginning. And you should probably look up your clan. And that's pretty much where I leave them, because I can teach them through the game. And I think that's better as a GM to teach your players through the game just in general, because those are the things that they care about. They don't care about the charred elves to the south of Aeronoth if they're going to be in the north.
Right, exactly. If it's not affecting the game right now, if you on your own time want to dig into that, like you're saying,
yeah,
go for it. But I like the idea that you give them some basic things to chew into. And so if you're looking to run this, do this. If you're looking to run sort of an Asian-flavored D&D game or any RPG, find some Wikipedia articles. And there's no wrong way to do it. In my mind, I always have this sort of fear that, I'm not an expert on this stuff, so what if I pull the wrong article? It's like, who's going to know? Who's going to care?
I mean,
like,
in the end, people probably aren't going to know. And if you do mix it up a little bit, sometimes it gives it a unique flavor anyways, so that it doesn't feel like it's 100% Japanese or 100% this, that, or the other thing. Like, the most like proto state of me planning a campaign usually begins with me watching a movie and going, wow, that's awesome. I like what they did here, but the rest of the movie was garbage. This little kernel of greatness that was in this D-rated film is amazing. Let's explore that. And then I'll like Google that film and I'll look up information about what kind of led to that film, and I'll kind of spider my way out looking at different pieces towards that one little bit that I was interested in. And like, recently, I've come to really love the way that Korean martial arts are done, just as far as the culture and the Goryeo Empire, which is where Korea actually gets its name from. It was kind of the empire that became Korea. And it's this really amazing kind of melting pot that happened during that time. And it's really influencing my own D&D 5th edition kind of Oriental Adventures setting called Shaoyun, where it's kind of a mix between like late warring states right after unification in the Goryeo Empire, the warring states of China, I should say. And it's definitely interesting to find these little kernels and things to use. Like, my favorite thing about Chinese culture is how the dead is represented. The undead, there's not just zombies. There's like 14 types of zombies that exist for 14 separate reasons.
Wow.
And then there's like 18 types of ghosts that, like, they're all hungry ghosts, but what they're hungry for defines what they are. Like, one of them, there's this weird ghost. It's actually a Japanese one. It's a hair ghost. It lives at the bottom of the wells, and it takes beautiful women's long hair because its hair fell out as it was close to dying, and it felt rage about it, so it lingered on the earth, and it steals women's hair. That's all it does.
Wow.
It does nothing malicious other than it scalps women at night.
So here's a tip. This is going to be a kind of reverse tip. Let's say you've watched this whole stream, and you're not in a place to immediately run any kind of Asian-themed adventure. Look up the Chinese ghosts and the Chinese undead. Take any of those weird idiosyncrasies or quirks or things like that, plug them into a normal standard D&D undead like a banshee, and immediately you have a whole new story. And it's not just textbook banshee. It's this banshee wants hair, and that's just so much cooler to me.
Yeah, and like a lot of the ghosts, like the yokai from the Japanese story, they have like these weird obsessions, and a lot of them aren't really malicious either. They're just like, why are you still here? Why are you collecting hair of all things? Like,
right.
And like players don't really know how to respond to that sometimes, because like you tell them, okay, there's this funky ghost that wants some funky stuff, and if you don't get rid of him, it's just going to keep plaguing these villagers. So,
and I love that, and I love sort of Xeno desires, these odd, not normal to the average person desires, because having to think in that way makes your players they really have to problem solve. They can't just say, well, let's just kill it. It's like, well, no, it comes back. It's not going to die. You have to figure out what it wants and approach this problem differently, not from what a human would want, but from what a ghost who steals hair would want.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some great stuff that I listed as far as inspiration on that document. One thing that I didn't put on there, which I'll add later, is there's a podcast about the history of China. If you don't care about the actual history of China and you just want to get some mythological inspiration, episode 1 is full of it. Episode 2 starts to get into the real history of China, but there's still a lot of like pseudo mythology going on in there. And there's a lot of really cool stuff inside there, like talking about how the Yellow River Valley is so important to China and what actually makes agriculture so important to that culture. And those are things that you can steal for any game, really. Thinking about things like what should shape your culture ultimately.
Yeah, I think that is a very good thing to lift. Like the things you're talking about, you can immediately start taking those ideas, and it's like, well, where should I start? I want to start doing this in my campaigns, but I feel like I don't know about it. Steal everything.
Yeah. Steal
it. Like if you want the easiest thing to do, watch a movie that you like from the list, Chris, and if you're just joining us now, or if it's been a while and you've forgotten, in the comments to this video, there's a link to a Google Drive, and in the Google Drive, it's basically your 5e Asian inspiration drive. And there are different things about European and Asian equivalents for weapons, new weapons, but there's also a list of movies, TV, and books. I personally would say low barrier of entry, slap on a movie. It's a 2-hour investment, and if you find one you love, that's your mini campaign. Start there and copy everything, because you're going to go in and you're going to start, okay, I'm going to copy this, and here's what you're going to do. Well, why did he use that armor? Google, Google, Google. Why is it that enemy? Why did he say that? Google, Google, Google. And before you know it, you know just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great kind of low investment item that I think would really help you, particularly Tim, is Legend of the Five Rings has a comic called Death at Khotan, which is more focused on L5R, but L5R is so focused on Japanese culture and creating a fantasy Japanese culture that it kind of shows you about how a murder mystery is conducted when it goes across multiple clans. It's a single issue. It's like $9.99, but they put it on sale on drive-through like two, 3 times a year. I think when I bought it, it was like $2.99 or something like that, because it was on one of those really good sales. And it's like 40 pages or something like that, but it's a really good introduction. And I think that's part of the thing that really draws me to Asian style games is the political nature. And I love mysteries in games. I told your brother that I was going to break out Microscope and make a mystery with Microscope to kind of show him how to establish a mystery. So that's going to come up on the channel pretty soon here, because I got the book. In fact, I might start filming it tomorrow. But
awesome. I can't wait.
But I love doing mysteries and ghost stories and stuff like that. So for me, that just jives right into the cultural aspects, and I don't have to do a lot of stretches. There's player buy-in automatically for those topics when you start talking about Oriental adventures.
Yeah, I agree, man. I think I'm dying to see that video. No pressure. That's going to be amazing.
I think I want to do it in Roll20. That way you can see it a little bit better.
Sure.
I remember watching it on Roll Up and Die, and they had it on like crotch cam the whole time.
Yeah, they did. They super did. I remember that. Oh my gosh. Well, everybody, I think we're going to call it here. I know we still have like 20 people watching, which is incredible, for midnight on the East Coast. Yep. I know even just a few people have joined us, but the video is going to take a while to buffer. I'm warning you now. So I'm going to get 3 messages tonight minimum of, I tried starting the video over and it's not working. This one's going to take a while. So Chris, I'm going to throw it to you. Are there any closing thoughts, anything you want to reiterate or just wrap up with?
I want to take a moment just to thank you for bringing me on the channel to talk about this stuff. I feel really encouraged because for the longest time, I played L5R and I could find people for that, but to do D&D Oriental Adventures, it's kind of a select crowd that's really into that. And to see that there's 30 people tuning in at midnight on the East Coast is really warming to me. It makes me feel very confident when I start throwing up some Xiaoyun games and putting out my beta testing. I recently released a barbarian path that's designed around collecting souls of restless undead, which was pretty
cool. Your character concepts are so cool. That is amazing.
Yeah, that one's a barbarian path, and then I did want to throw out one thing because I promised Marquise I would.
Sure.
So not only am I part of Drop Dice, I am 1/3 of a point of inspiration. We will be coming back, and we will be putting out more supplements again. We had some life things that kind of threw us off, but we are slowly getting back on our feet. Still kind of recovering from some of those life episodes. But one of the things that we do intend to do is have some stuff about either Xiaoyun or possibly just a Mythic China type setting book so that you can get some inspiration and ideas from that sort of thing. No official release date on that, but you'll see stuff crop up from me saying, hey, does anybody want to beta test this new Paladin path or something like that I've been working on?
Totally love it. And you've got a crowd here of very interested, very smart people. I can't wait to see the comments we get after I post the video, but you have done an amazing job. Thank you for coming on, spending the whole night with us, and just telling us from your experience what works, what doesn't work. Anyone can go and find the information, but I like putting it all in one place, tempered by your experience with it.
Absolutely, and I mentioned it earlier. If you did have questions that weren't answered by this video, be sure and shoot me a message. If it's something that I can't answer because it's specific to Reichen, I'm sure Tim will eventually get to you on a mailbag of devouring or something at some point.
Sure. Absolutely. And Chris, what's the best way for anyone finding this video to get a hold of you? Do you prefer Facebook, email, what?
I typically prefer Facebook just because it comes to my phone. I'm a little bit more apt to answer that quickly. If you comment to videos, I will respond quickly. If you send me a YouTube message, I just learned what those were about a week ago. So for the people that have been messaging me for 2 years now, I'm sorry.
Oh, man, I remember when I figured that out. I was like, oh, man.
Yeah, I had a message from like Don Forgecast from when I first started the channel. And he was like, hey, man, do you want to get together and do a video just to kind of introduce your channel? And I was like, oh, yeah, it says it's like a year and a half ago. Oops.
Oh, buddy.
I snub you. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Oh, man, that's a bummer. Well, reach out to Drop Dice. Super cool guy. Super mechanical minded, but also very story minded. It's difficult to find that, married together so well. So thank you all for tuning in. This has been amazing. Be sure to subscribe. If you like this, we're going to start doing this more. I'm going to probably snag Rob Coletta from Performance Check and do one of these, probably about like acting and role playing and how, because he's a professional actor, how you can act and what it would look like and tips people can use. So we're going to try to do more of these videos and just pull from the community. But thank you all for watching. Thanks again, Chris. And for everyone who's still in the chat, hang out. I might still type away and do some different stuff in there and just hang out with everybody. But it's Friday. Have a fantastic weekend. If you're watching this live, don't forget that tomorrow around 1 p.m. Eastern, I am going to be rolling up my character for the second season of The Provokers. And that also means that this coming Sunday is session 1 of season 2 of The Provokers. So be provoked. Tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern if you want to see me roll up a druid. Chris is going to be there rolling up his druid. It's going to be fantastic. So until next time, may your dice roll high.